Something shifted in California this week that most people haven't fully registered yet. Coca-Cola, one of the most recognizable brands in American corporate history, has decided to close one of its production facilities in the state. This isn't a temporary shutdown or a seasonal adjustment. It's a permanent closure, and the timing raises questions that go beyond just one company's internal restructuring. California has been wrestling with a complex economic environment for years now. Rising operational costs, evolving labor regulations, energy price volatility, and an increasingly difficult business climate that's been pushing manufacturers to reconsider their footprint in the state. When a corporation with Coca-Cola's resources and market presence makes a move like this, it's worth pausing to understand what's actually driving the decision. State officials have already begun responding, framing the closure within broader economic narratives. But the underlying message is clear. California's industrial landscape is changing, and not always in ways that favor long-term manufacturing stability. For workers, local economies, and policymakers across the country watching how blue states manage business retention, this closure is more than just a headline. It's a data point in a larger pattern that deserves serious attention. The factory in question is located in the city of Downey, just south of Los Angeles. And for decades, it stood as part of the broader manufacturing infrastructure that once defined California's economic engine. Coca-Cola employed hundreds of workers at this facility, many of whom had been with the company for years, building careers around the steady rhythm of production lines, distribution networks, and logistical coordination that kept beverages flowing across the western United States. When the announcement came down, it wasn't accompanied by dramatic fanfare or public controversy. It was presented as a business decision, framed around efficiency, modernization, and the need to consolidate operations in a way that made financial sense for a global corporation navigating an increasingly competitive marketplace. But if you dig a little deeper, the closure starts to look less like an isolated incident and more like a symptom of something larger that's been unfolding across California for the better part of a decade. This isn't the first time a major manufacturer has pulled back from the state, and it likely won't be the last. Over the past several years, California has seen a steady outflow of corporate headquarters, production facilities, and regional offices relocating to states like Texas, Arizona, Nevada, and Tennessee. Some of these moves have been high-profile, covered extensively in the business press, while others have happened quietly, without much public attention. But the cumulative effect is undeniable. California, once the undisputed leader in American innovation and economic growth, is now facing a credibility crisis when it comes to retaining the kinds of businesses that provide stable, middle-class employment. The reasons behind this shift are complex and can't be reduced to any single policy or political decision. California has always been an expensive state to operate in, but that cost was traditionally offset by access to talent, infrastructure, ports, and a consumer base that justified the investment. What's changed in recent years is the gap between cost and value. Energy prices in California are among the highest in the nation, driven by a combination of environmental regulations, grid instability, and long-term infrastructure underinvestment. Labor costs have also increased significantly, not just because of minimum wage laws, but due to a growing web of compliance requirements, benefits mandates, and legal liabilities that make employing people in California more complicated and more expensive than in most other states. Then there's the regulatory environment itself. California has more than 400 state agencies and departments, many of which have overlapping jurisdiction and enforcement authority. For a company like Coca-Cola, operating a manufacturing facility means navigating environmental permits, water usage restrictions, waste disposal regulations, air quality standards, workplace safety inspections, and a host of local ordinances that can vary from city to city. It's not that these regulations are inherently unreasonable. Many of them exist for legitimate public health and environmental reasons, but the cumulative burden creates a friction that makes it harder to operate efficiently. And when a corporation is deciding where to invest capital, where to expand, or where to consolidate, friction matters. If you can achieve the same production output in a state with lower costs, fewer regulatory hurdles, and a more predictable business climate, the choice becomes straightforward. What makes this particular closure significant is who it's affecting and what it represents symbolically. Coca-Cola isn't a struggling startup or a niche manufacturer operating on thin margins. It's one of the most profitable and globally recognized brands in existence. If a company with that kind of financial cushion is deciding that California no longer makes sense as a production hub, it sends a signal to other corporations that are watching closely. And they are watching. Business leaders across the country pay attention to these decisions because they provide insight into where the economic winds are blowing. When a major player exits or downsizes, it often precedes a broader shift in investment patterns. California officials have responded to the closure with a mix of empathy and defensiveness. Governor Gavin Newsom's office released a statement expressing concern for the workers affected and emphasizing the state's commitment to supporting displaced employees through retraining programs and unemployment assistance. Local representatives in Downey have been more vocal, criticizing Coca-Cola for what they describe as a lack of communication and calling for greater corporate accountability when it comes to mass layoffs. But beneath the rhetoric, there's a recognition that California is facing a structural problem that can't be solved with press releases or short-term relief programs. The state is losing its competitive edge in manufacturing, and the political will to reverse that trend remains unclear. Part of the challenge is that California's political leadership has spent the past decade prioritizing different goals. Environmental sustainability, social equity, housing affordability, and climate resilience have dominated the legislative agenda, often at the expense of policies that would make the state more attractive to traditional industries. This isn't necessarily a criticism. These are important issues that deserve attention, but it does create a tension that hasn't been fully reconciled. You can't simultaneously increase the cost and complexity of doing business while expecting corporations to stay put out of loyalty or inertia. Businesses operate on incentives, and when the incentive structure shifts against them, they adapt accordingly. What's particularly troubling about the Coca-Cola closure is the ripple effect it will have on the surrounding community. The factory didn't just employ Coca-Cola workers. It supported a network of suppliers, contractors, maintenance providers, and service businesses that depended on the facility's operations. When a plant closes, it's not just the direct employees who suffer, it's the trucking companies that hauled materials in and out, the uniform suppliers, the vending machine operators, the local restaurants and cafes where workers grabbed lunch. These secondary and tertiary economic impacts are often overlooked in the initial coverage of a closure, but they compound over time, weakening the economic fabric of a region in ways that are difficult to reverse. Downey itself has a complicated economic history. It was once home to a thriving aerospace industry, anchored by companies like North American Aviation and Rockwell International. But as defense spending shifted and aerospace contracts moved elsewhere, Downey's industrial base eroded. The city has tried to reinvent itself, focusing on retail, healthcare, and service industries. But the loss of high-wage manufacturing jobs has left a gap that hasn't been fully filled. The Coca-Cola closure is another blow to a community that's already dealt with decades of economic transition, and it raises questions about what kind of future California is building for its working-class residents. There's also a broader demographic dimension to this story that deserves attention. California has long been a destination for immigrants and working-class families seeking opportunity, and manufacturing jobs have historically provided a pathway to the middle class for people without advanced degrees or specialized skills. When those jobs disappear, the economic ladder gets harder to climb. Service sector jobs, which have been growing in California, don't always offer the same wages, benefits, or stability that manufacturing jobs provided. This shift has contributed to California's growing inequality, where wealth is increasingly concentrated among highly educated professionals in tech, finance, and entertainment, while everyone else struggles with rising costs and stagnant incomes. The response from Coca-Cola has been carefully managed. Company spokespeople have emphasized that the decision was driven by the need to optimize their supply chain and reduce redundancy across their North American operations. They've pointed out that they still have facilities in other parts of the country and that the closure is part of a strategic realignment, not a retreat from the market. They've also committed to offering severance packages and job placement assistance to affected workers. But for the people losing their jobs, these corporate explanations offer little comfort. They're not concerned with supply chain optimization. They're concerned with mortgage payments, healthcare coverage, and how they're going to support their families in one of the most expensive housing markets in the United States. This brings us to one of the central tensions in California's current economic predicament. The state has an incredibly dynamic and wealthy economy, driven largely by Silicon Valley, Hollywood, finance, and a booming real estate market. On paper, California is thriving. It's home to more billionaires than any other state. Its GDP rivals that of entire countries, and its cultural influence is unmatched. But this prosperity is unevenly distributed. The economic gains of the past 2 decades have accrued primarily to the top earners, while middle and lower income Californians have seen their cost of living skyrocket without corresponding wage growth. Housing prices in particular have become a crisis, with the median home price in many coastal cities exceeding $1 million, pricing out entire generations of workers. When you combine this housing crisis with the loss of stable manufacturing jobs, you get a situation where California is increasingly becoming a place only the wealthy can afford. This has political implications that extend far beyond economics. California has traditionally been a progressive stronghold, and its Democratic leadership has championed policies aimed at addressing inequality, expanding social services, and protecting the environment. But there's a growing disconnect between these policy goals and the lived experience of many Californians who feel left behind by the state's economic transformation. This disconnect has fueled frustration, resentment, and in some cases, a quiet exodus of residents seeking more affordable and opportunity-rich states. The data on migration patterns tells a sobering story. For several years now, more people have been leaving California than moving in, a reversal of historical trends that once saw the state as the ultimate destination for Americans seeking a fresh start. The people leaving aren't just retirees seeking lower taxes or cheaper housing. They're young families, middle-income earners, and skilled workers who've concluded that California no longer offers the quality of life or economic opportunity that justifies its high costs. They're moving to places like Texas, Idaho, Colorado, and North Carolina, where housing is more affordable, job markets are growing, and the overall business climate feels more welcoming. Corporate relocations follow a similar pattern. Tesla moved its headquarters from Palo Alto to Austin. Oracle relocated to Austin as well. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise moved to Houston. Charles Schwab went to Texas. These aren't marginal companies or fly-by-night operations. They're some of the most established and influential corporations in their respective industries, and their departures represent a vote of no confidence in California's ability to remain competitive. Each move takes with it jobs, tax revenue, and economic activity that California can't easily replace. What's striking about the political response to these departures is how defensive and dismissive it's often been. Rather than acknowledging the legitimate concerns driving these decisions and working to address them, California's leadership has sometimes framed corporate exits as good riddance, suggesting that companies leaving are prioritizing profit over values or that they're fleeing accountability. This rhetoric might play well with the progressive base, but it does nothing to solve the underlying problem. Businesses aren't moral actors. They respond to incentives. And if California wants to retain and attract employers, it needs to offer an environment where they can succeed. The Coca-Cola closure is a test case for how California handles this challenge going forward. Will state and local officials use this as an opportunity to reevaluate policies that may be driving businesses away? Or will they treat it as an isolated incident that doesn't require systemic change? Early indications suggest the latter. The response has focused on worker assistance and corporate criticism, but there's been little discussion of regulatory reform, energy cost reduction, or streamlining the permitting process. Without addressing these structural issues, more closures are inevitable. There's also the question of what this means for national economic policy and the ongoing debate about industrial strategy. The United States as a whole has been grappling with deindustrialization for decades, losing manufacturing jobs to automation, offshoring, and consolidation. California's experience is a microcosm of this larger trend, but it also highlights the role that state-level policies play in either accelerating or mitigating these shifts. If states like Texas and Arizona can create environments where manufacturing remains viable while California cannot, it suggests that policy choices matter more than we sometimes acknowledge. For the workers in Downey and communities like it across California, the closure is a personal tragedy wrapped in economic jargon. These are people who did everything right, who showed up to work, who built their lives around the promise of stable employment, and who are now facing an uncertain future through no fault of their own. The broader economic forces at play, globalization, automation, regulatory complexity, are beyond their control, yet they bear the consequences. This is the human cost of economic transition, and it's a cost that California's policymakers need to take seriously if they want to maintain public trust and social cohesion. As this story continues to unfold, it will be worth watching not just what happens to the workers and the facility itself, but what happens to California's broader economic trajectory. Will this be remembered as a turning point, a moment when the state began to reckon with the consequences of its policy choices, or will it be just another data point in a long decline? The answer will depend on whether California's leaders are willing to have difficult conversations about trade-offs, competitiveness, and the kind of economy they want to build for the future. Right now, those conversations aren't happening, and that silence is perhaps the most concerning aspect of this entire situation.